So what actually happens to a civilization when its greatest empire collapses? If you open up a standard history textbook, the story they tell is usually pretty grim. The general assumption is that once a massive, unifying power falls apart, the whole region just plunges straight into a dark age. You know, a time of fractured states, declining culture, and total economic ruin. But history, as it turns out, is rarely ever that simple. Sometimes, the shattering of an old order is exactly what makes room for an unprecedented explosion of growth.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into India's post-Mauryan period, a massive window stretching from roughly 200 BC all the way to 300 AD. For the longest time, this 500-year gap was brushed off as just a chaotic stepping stone between the mighty Mauryan Empire and the rise of the Guptas. But the actual evidence paints a remarkably different picture. Rather than a dark, fractured time, this half-millennium was an era of explosive urbanization, amazing cultural synthesis, and a level of global connection that honestly rivals modern trade. We aren't looking at a collapse here at all. We're looking at a profound transformation.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really get our heads around this complex era, we're going to break it down through 5 key pillars: the shifting political landscape, the art of the Satavahanas, the evolution of society and Jatis, the golden age of trade, and finally, the evolution of religions.
All right, starting off with pillar number 1, a rapidly shifting political landscape. For centuries, Magadha was absolutely the center of Indian political power. But then, foreign invasions from the northwest completely flipped the script, forcing a massive westward shift. Political power moved toward the Deccan and the far south, and city life didn't just survive this transition, it spread like wildfire. We're talking about the third great phase of urbanization in Indian history. Just look at the major centers booming during this time: Taxila, Pushkalavati, Purushapura, Mathura, Hastinapur, Indraprastha, Sakata, Kasambi. I mean, the list goes on and on. The sheer scale of this urban boom is staggering. You had new political centers pouring money into new infrastructure, creating vibrant, bustling cities all across the map. Moving right along to pillar 2, the art of the Satavahanas. And this brilliantly illustrates the incredible heights of the Amravati School of art. Heavily patronized by the Satavahana and Ikshvaku dynasties, this artistic movement exploded in major centers like Amravati and Nagarjunakonda. The artists were working with a stunning medium, pristine white marble. And they weren't just carving static, boring figures. Kings and princes were depicted actively engaging with the world, grouped together in these really dynamic scenes. But honestly, their most famous achievement was how they rendered female figures. The artists managed to capture a huge variety of moods and intricate poses, breathing a remarkable sense of life, emotion, and fluid movement into cold, hard stone.
Now for pillar 3, society and the evolution of Jatis.
So with all this change, society was going through a profound shakeup. You had an influx of foreign traders bringing in alien cultural practices, and at the exact same time, a massive boom in crafts and trade meant that groups traditionally viewed as lower in the social hierarchy, specifically the Vaishyas and Shudras, were suddenly gaining serious economic and social power. The old social order was basically cracking under the pressure. To handle this newly blended and empowered population, lawmakers had to innovate. By the 2nd century AD, they invented a concept called Varna Samkara, which was a systematic way to classify and explain the mixed marriages happening between couples of the original Varnas. The second key concept they developed was Vratya, which literally defined the non-performance of sacred duties. When you put Varna Samskara and Vratya together, you get the foundational building blocks for what would become a highly rigid Jati system. It was essentially an elaborate, categorized attempt by lawmakers to maintain social order and hierarchy in a world that was transforming economically and culturally way faster than the old rules could handle. You can see exactly how this rigid classification played out in the historical texts of the era. The Manusmriti, compiled around this time, actually mentions about 60 distinct jatis. It reveals a very strict method of assimilation and, in many cases, severe marginalization. For example, foreign groups like the Sakas were assigned a degenerated Kshatriya status, acknowledging their military power but keeping them outside traditional purity lines. Meanwhile, tribal groups like the Karavaras, Bukasas, and Kaivarthas faced severe consequences. Texts assigned them untouchable status, imposing profound social and religious disabilities on them. It's a pretty stark reminder of how societies often react to rapid change by drawing incredibly rigid lines. Okay, let's pull back to the big picture for Pillar 4, the Golden Age of Trade. During this period, the economy went completely into overdrive. Money became the primary medium of exchange, replacing old bartering systems, and craftspersons were producing goods in massive quantities. To really grasp the scale of this internal boom, imagine taking a journey down the Uttarapatha, the Great Northern Grand Trunk Road. Picture a merchant caravan starting out on day 1 in Pushkalavati, over in modern-day Pakistan. 10 days later, they hit Taxila. By day 20, they're in Mathura. Day 30 brings them to the sacred city of Varanasi. Day 40, they pass through the ancient capital of Pataliputra. And finally, by day 50, they arrive at the eastern seaport of Tamralipti. This massive highway was the absolute lifeline connecting the inland heartland to the booming maritime trade on the coasts.
But the Uttarapatha was just one piece of the puzzle. You also had the Dakshinapatha, a vital southern route, pumping wealth from the Ganges basin into wealthy Godavari Valley towns like Ujjain. Now, domestic wealth is one thing, but here's where it gets mind-blowing: the international scene. Look at the famous Silk Route. It ran from China, down through Tibet and Sikkim, straight to the Indian port of Broach, before sailing onwards to Rome. Think about that for a second. China was literally utilizing Indian territory and Indian ports to export its silk and porcelain to the Romans. India was the undisputed geographic and economic crossroads of the ancient world.
And you don't facilitate that kind of global trade without serious infrastructure. The subcontinent's coastline was absolutely dotted with thriving seaports. On the western coast, you had massive hubs like Barukacha or Broach. Down south on the Malabar coast in Kerala, the legendary port of Muziris was handling insane amounts of international traffic. And over on the eastern coast, places like Tamralipti and Poduka, which is modern-day Arkamedu, were sending ships far across the ocean. These specific ports were the gateways connecting India to Europe via the Red Sea and deep into Central Asia through the Gulf.
So what does this all add up to? Try this on for size. 500 million. According to ancient sources, a staggering 500 million sesterces, the currency of the Roman Empire, in pure Roman gold was draining out of Europe and pouring right into India every single year. Now, what's really interesting about this is the total geopolitical panic it caused over in Rome. The Roman author Pliny was furiously complaining about this Indo-Roman trade deficit. He literally wrote a letter to Emperor Tiberius practically begging him to ban Indian trade because of this massive drain of Roman wealth. And we know this wasn't an exaggeration. The historical text, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, noted that 120 ships were leaving India for Egypt annually. It was true ancient globalization, and India held all the economic leverage.
And finally, we arrive at Pillar 5, the evolution of Indian religions.
Look, you simply cannot have this level of economic upheaval, urbanization, and cultural intermingling without it fundamentally altering how people view the divine. During this era, a massive spiritual synthesis occurred. The absolute cornerstone of religious life shifted toward devotional image worship housed in permanent shrines. This is exactly when we see Mahayana Buddhism emerge as a more accessible devotional path. In the Brahminical religion, worship of the Trinity, especially Vishnu and Shiva, really takes center stage. Jainism even adopted idolatry during this period, which is how we get those incredible Mathura-style sculptures of Jain Tirthankaras. Plus, we see the powerful rise of Bhagavatism. Religion shifted from abstract rituals to highly personal, localized devotion.
Which brings us right back to where we started. We asked what happens when a great empire falls, but after looking at all this evidence, sprawling new urban centers, 500 million sesterces of Roman gold pouring into Indian ports, dynamic new art forms, and a profound evolution of society and spirituality, we really have to reframe our thinking. If a fallen empire leads to this level of massive global trade and incredible cultural synthesis, was it really a collapse? Or was it actually a remarkable rebirth? It's a fascinating perspective that kind of forces you to rethink everything we assume about ancient history, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the narrative.